Oh, hello. What I've known for some time about GCSE, IGCSE English language is that being very good at writing can only take you so far in your quest for the golden grail of an A star or a 9. Of course it helps, but both CIE papers require very particular techniques in order to access the highest marks. This video will talk you through what is needed in the directed writing question of the 0627 CIE IGCSE English Language Paper 2. The CIE IGCSE English Language 0522 course also contains a directed writing question which is very similar, and so pupils taking this exam will also find this video invaluable. Fancy achieving the equivalent to a magnificent 170 checkout in darts?
Which is a maximum to leave, the maximum finish, treble 20. That's another, now the bullseye.
Well, stay tuned, you're watching a Schofield on Shakespeare guide to IGCSE English Language Directed Writing. As with my video on descriptive writing, I have colour-coded headers to make it easier for you to come back to sections you have found particularly useful. The overview of the directed writing task is headed green, sample passages and question headed blue, a detailed exploration of the mark scheme, including examples to explain key terminology, is headed yellow. My own response to the sample passages and question has a grey header. Finally, this response is picked apart and related closely to individual parts of the mark scheme within slides with a brown header. So, directed writing. What is required? Well, you are given two passages with differing perspectives on a single topic, such as homeowners swapping properties to get a cheap holiday, a scheme in which elder people rent out a room, or homeschooling. You then need to write a letter or article which shows your understanding of the passage in your own words and develops and evaluates the information. There are certain keywords in the mark scheme that I would like to explore in more detail. Candidates need to evaluate, assimilate, synthesise and develop. However, pure dictionary definitions have only limited value, and I feel it is generally better to use examples to illustrate exactly what each term means. So, without any further talking, let's go straight to a sample question and the two passages. Imagine that your aunt and uncle are considering sending your cousin to boarding school and have asked for your views. Your cousin is an only child and, in your opinion, rather spoilt. Write a letter to your aunt and uncle in which you should explain the advantages of attending a boarding school, the reasons why a boarding school may not be suitable, why you would or would not recommend a boarding school for your cousin. Base your letter on the two passages only. Address each of the three bullets. Be careful to use your own words. Write about 250 to 350 words. Begin your letter, Dear Aunt and Uncle.
I preferred being in a war zone to going to boarding school. When I was 7, my parents took me to Oxford. I remember us having tea in a house with this couple who seemed to have a load of kids. Then my mum said, "Bye," and I didn't see them for 4 months. My parents assure me they explained they were leaving me there, but I have no memory of it. I had to write them a letter every Sunday. I'd write, "Dear Mum and Dad, I effing hate it here. Get me out of here." The guy would check it, apparently to make sure it was long enough. and he'd say, "I don't think Mum and Dad want to read that, do they?" My mum recently showed me the letter she'd received from me, and it was stuff like, "Dear Mum and Dad, the film this Sunday was Where Eagles Dare. The first 15 won. I'm very happy." And the school was full of freaks who became complete Euro trash or ended up running the country. Plus Radiohead and Tim Henman. I didn't send my kids to boarding school. It's made sense for my parents since they were living in Lebanon, but I don't see the point of having kids if you're just going to send them off to prison. I felt trapped with 50 people I hated for 5 years, and I want my kids to have a home life. People who send their kids to boarding school have too much money and have given up on being parents. The minute you send your kids to boarding school, it's the end of your relationship with them. It's like them leaving home. That's going to happen at 18. I don't want it to happen at 7. Boarding schools are why every generation of upper-class Brits are emotional cripples and are into sadomasochism and marry their cousins. Boarding school makes you tough and teaches you to put up a defence, but it means you become a horrible person, and I don't want my kids to be like that. In the private tuition website, the author states some of the advantages of boarding schools. Boarding schools are exceptionally expensive, but if you are in the lucky position where it is an option, is it the right choice for your child? Each child is different, and while some children thrive at boarding school, others loathe being away from home. Either outcome could have a lasting effect, so sending your child away from home is something to consider carefully. We thought we would offer a brief overview of some of the advantages of boarding school. Advantages. Boarding schools often create stronger friendships and alumni networks which last for a lifetime. Children are kept at arm's length from the parties, drinking and drugs that are sometimes more easily available to pupils at day schools. Children benefit from additional non-classroom contact with teachers in the evening, as well as supervised homework, music practice time and other extracurricular activities. Students are kept occupied in the evening. There is less use of technology and students are often more social. Students tend to be more independent and confident.
So here's the question once again. It's so important to read the question carefully in order to ensure a sharp focus on the task in hand. The top band of the writing mark scheme requires a highly effective register for audience and purpose. So the language you use needs to be exactly appropriate for, in this example, a nephew writing a letter to his aunt or uncle, not as formal as a letter to a head teacher or a potential employer, but not as informal as an email or social media post to a friend. The question can often give little clues about how you might choose to respond to the task. Here, it tells us that your cousin is, in your opinion, rather spoilt. This suggests to me that you might be wiser to recommend that your cousin does go to boarding school. But of course, you need to be careful how you write and suggest this. After all, aunts and uncles don't like being implicitly criticised by presumptuous, arrogant nephews or nieces. You need to get the tone of the letter right. So I've mentioned one aspect of the writing scheme. Let's have a look at the top 3 bands in closer detail. As well as writing appropriately for, in this case, a letter to an aunt and uncle, you also need to show that you can structure your writing effectively. For this particular question, it makes it easiest for the examiner if you structure your letter following the 3 bullet points in sequence. This of course doesn't mean that you will only have 3 paragraphs. As well as having an introductory paragraph clearly stating the purpose of the letter and a short conclusion, you may choose to develop one of the bullet points and expand your ideas into a further paragraph. That's all fine, but make it easy for the examiner to follow and mark. On to vocabulary. Yes, you are writing a letter to your aunt and uncle giving advice about whether their spoiled brat should go to boarding school, but you are also completing an IGCSE English language exam in which to some extent you want to show off how well you can write. The key word here is precise rather than complex. If a complex word fits the context, definitely use it, but it needs to flow and not to jar. Varied sentence structures. For those of you with a more technical bent, make sure that you don't just use complex sentences, but also have some effective simple and compound ones. For those of you less technical, consider sentence length. If every sentence is the same length, say 20 odd words, your writing can become more monotonous and less effective. Think also about how you begin each sentence. If every sentence begins with the or a, or even the subject, that too can be boring. For this task, you can increase variety by occasionally beginning sentences with connectives such as however, additionally, which also helps you develop your points, or by subordinate clauses such as, for example, when Alfred becomes a teenager, comma, or weighing up the advantages and disadvantages, comma. And finally, accuracy. Does every sentence make clear sense? Have you used a wide range of punctuation? So not just commas, full stops and question marks, but dashes, brackets, colons and semicolons too. Spelling cannot be improved overnight. But do you care enough? Do you have sufficient discipline to look up spelling errors as identified by your English teacher and create lists to be learnt at the back of your exercise book?
The writing mark scheme is fairly straightforward to understand. It's also important to remember that in this exam and in this question, the majority of marks are for the quality and accuracy of your writing. 25 out of 40 for this directed writing question and 65 out of 80 for the exam as a whole. So what about the remaining 15 marks?
I want to start with the second bullet point. Synthesise and develop a wide range of evidence. What does this word synthesise mean? So essentially, you don't just go systematically through the passages, paraphrasing each relevant point and putting it sequentially into your letter or article. They are looking for something more sophisticated. There will be times when you may show an implicit understanding of some points from the beginning of the passage, say, but nuance it with an implicit understanding of a point made much later on. Let's look at a practical example of this. On the left-hand side, you can see some extracts from the passages. Read these through again, pressing pause. The recording will start again in 5 seconds. Now you can see a sample response which aims to synthesize, combine points from different places and develop. I write, I agree that Alfred at times seems to struggle under pressure, and being at boarding school would quickly teach him resilience. Over time he is likely to make excellent long-term friendships. All that chatting and frantic pillow fighting late into the night in dormitories inevitably results in stronger bonds with peers.
What am I doing here? Well, firstly, I am combining positive points from different sections of the two passages within consecutive sentences. I show my understanding of Dom Jolly's idea that boarding school makes you tough and teaches you to put up a defence, within the idea that boarding school would quickly teach my cousin resilience. Note also how at the beginning of the sentence I make a point about my cousin which is not included within the passage, saying that at times he struggles under pressure. Whilst this does not give me any reading marks, it is of course perfectly natural and to be expected to make a few personal references about a cousin in a letter to his parents, and this kind of phrase ensures that my register is highly effective for audience and purpose. In my subsequent sentence, I skip to showing an understanding of passage B's point about friendships, which I develop in an engaging way, thus increasing my writing mark by referencing activities which might, over time, lead to better friendships, late night chatting in dormitories and frantic pillow fighting. Now on to this idea of successfully evaluating. What does this word mean? There is the dictionary definition. I prefer to think of evaluating as weighing up. So the writer has made this or that assertion. What do we think of it? Do we agree completely? Or is there perhaps another perspective that needs to be considered and explored? Let's go again to a practical example. On the left-hand side, you can see some extracts from passage B. Read these again, pressing pause. Now, here's my response showing an understanding of the extracts. I write, when Alfred becomes a teenager, he is likely to be exposed to some extent to the dangerous temptations of alcohol and drugs. Parents of pupils at boarding schools can rest assured that pupils are not free from 4 p.m. to experiment and potentially get into terrible trouble, but have compulsory activities stretching well into the evening. That said, pupils at boarding school tend to be extremely well off and thus are unlikely to balk at the high price of illegal drugs such as cannabis and cocaine. Parents may think that their pupils are in safe, experienced hands, but how can you really know what is going on late at night within a boarding school miles and miles away? As in the previous example, I developed the original idea from the passage. Why is it that boarding school pupils may be less likely to take drugs? Well, this is partly because they are kept so busy, and note how I have assimilated this information from the second bullet point. Whereas pupils in day schools generally finish at 4 p.m, in boarding schools the finish time is more like 9 p.m. And after developing the point, I evaluate. Is it really true that boarding school pupils are less likely to drink alcohol and take drugs? I'm not so sure, and so I probe, I question, and introduce the argument that as so many are well off, drugs and alcohol are far more affordable. I also include the point that it is very difficult for parents to actually know what is going on within their child's boarding school. You can also see how I'm trying to show off how well I can write, as well as my ability to develop, assimilate and evaluate. Note the precise use of more complex vocabulary such as balk, meaning to hesitate or be willing to accept an idea or undertaking, and the use of potentially to add precision to my statement about teenagers getting into trouble. What about the punctuation? Well, within this passage alone, I use commas, full stops, but also a colon and a question mark. And I also take care to vary my sentence openers. Look at how the sentences begin. When Alfred, parents, that said, and parents, before ending the section with a rhetorical question to add further variety.
That's enough talking about the mark scheme and looking at practical examples. It's your turn now. In a moment, the question and extracts will reappear on screen with a 5 seconds pause between them. Reread the extracts, press pause and toggle between the slides so that you can produce an excellent letter for your dear aunt and uncle. Go for it! How did he get on? Did you produce a crisply written letter showing a probing, detailed understanding of the pros and cons of your cousin attending a boarding school based on the information provided in the 2 passages? Of course you did. Have another look at the mark scheme and try to estimate your mark out of 25 for writing and 15 for reading. Here's the response that I wrote. Dear Aunt and Uncle, many thanks for taking me out for dinner last weekend. It was lovely to see you both. I have now had an opportunity to think far more about whether Alfred should go to boarding school. What an important decision for his future. There are unquestionably numerous advantages. I agree that Alfred at times seems to struggle under pressure, and being at boarding school would quickly teach him resilience. Over time, he is likely to make excellent long-term friendships. All that chatting and frantic pillow fighting late into the night in dormitories inevitably results in stronger bonds with peers. Alfred would also be able to spend more time with his teachers in the evenings, who would be able to help him with those devious maths questions. We are both hopeless in this area, and generally act as inspiring role models. When Alfred becomes a teenager, it is likely that he will be exposed to the dangerous temptations of alcohol and drugs. However, parents of pupils at boarding schools can rest assured that pupils are not free from 4 p.m. to experiment and potentially get into terrible trouble, but have compulsory activities stretching well into the evening. But there are reasons why boarding school life might not suit Alfred. Yes, he might make excellent long-term friendships, but I can remember the time a few years ago when he was bullied. Boys spend so much time together at boarding school, and this means that there is the potential for longer periods of misery without the protection offered within your home. Imagine how distraught you would be to see Alfred's confidence and self-esteem plummet. Another point is that pupils at boarding school tend to be extremely well off, and thus are unlikely to balk at the high price of illegal drugs such as cannabis and cocaine. You may think that Alfred is in safe, experienced hands, but how can you really know what is going on late at night within a boarding school miles and miles away? What about Alfred's own feelings about going to boarding school? Is there a danger that he might feel resentful about being sent away from home at such a young age and harbour a long-term grudge towards you both? Overall, I think it would be worth taking Alfred to a nearby boarding school to discuss the options with the housemaster, provided he is reasonably open to the idea. He does seem to spend too much time playing computer games. Is he addicted to Clash Royale? And so he would benefit from the added structure and routine of boarding school life. The majority of boarding school pupils become more assertive and self-sufficient, so much so that many become leaders and politicians. And this environment is only likely to help Alfred in his future career plans. Best of luck in making the right decision. With love from your favourite nephew, Christian. Now let's reference certain sections of my response against the mark scheme. The hope is that you will be becoming sick to death of hearing these phrases from the mark scheme, so much so that you will know them off by heart and thus use them to ensure future directed writing tasks achieve outstanding marks. I don't get any reading marks for this introduction, but I do show the examiner that I have carefully read the question, that I understand that the letter is for my aunt and uncle, whom I am likely to see occasionally. I sum up the purpose of the letter in this first paragraph. It is to explore whether Alfred should go to boarding school or not. Note also how I have used both a colon and a semicolon accurately in this very first paragraph. So many pupils don't quite know how to use semicolons accurately. If you can, show it off in the early parts of your answer when the examiner is quickly coming to initial judgments about your ability. If you can't use colons and semicolons accurately or are a little hazy, look them up and practice some questions with them. As discussed earlier in this video, when talking about Alfred developing resilience, I am assimilating and showing an understanding of passage A when Dom Jolly declares bitterly that boarding school makes you tough and teaches you to put up a defence. I also develop the ideas from passage B, which states that children benefit from additional non-classroom contact with teachers in the evening, as well as supervised homework. Such teachers can help with areas of weakness such as maths. The phrase devious maths questions shows the use of a more complex, engaging adjective, devious, and also maintains a highly effective register. The occasional light-hearted, self-deprecating comment fits well within a nephew's letter to his aunt and uncle. Evaluation requires looking a little deeper into statements. Passage B states that boarding schools often create stronger friendships, but I want to question this. Is this necessarily going to be the case? Will this always happen? Rather than gaining lifelong friendships, could the near opposite occur, with greater potential for bullying? I'm also looking for opportunities to show off my range of vocabulary, whilst always making sure that it fits and flows within the context. I put myself in my aunt and uncle's shoes and spell distraught accurately before going on to use the more advanced verb plummet, meaning to fall very quickly and suddenly. In this section I am showing an implicit understanding of passage A, when Dom Jolly writes, "My parents assure me they explained they were leaving me there, but I have no memory of it. I had to write them a letter every Sunday. I'd write, 'Dear Mum and Dad, I effing hate it here. Get me out of here.'" Dom Jolly's simmering strong views against boarding schools are also shown later in the article when he reveals that, "I don't see the point of having kids if you're just going to send them off to prison. I felt trapped with 50 people I hated for 5 years and I want my kids to have a home life." The metaphor prison clearly shows his feelings of resentment against the experience of going to boarding school, and I think it is reasonable to assume that this has affected his relationship with his own parents in the longer term. It's also worth having a look at sentence openers. Look at the variety shown on screen now, taken from the second paragraph. This variety makes the writing far more interesting to read and improves the overall flow. So, what do you need to do to achieve success in this question? Let's sum it up. Number 1, read the 2 passages incredibly carefully. Don't rush into writing your response too early. You need to make sure you have fully understood the ideas in both passages and thought about how to respond to some of them. Number 2, remember the majority of the question is marked for your writing skills, 63%. So think about the words you choose. Don't just write, craft your sentences, remembering to vary length and type. Do use the full range of punctuation and think about the right tone to be used, and the exam will never require you to be overly informal. Number 3, it is not enough to just paraphrase points from the passage in your own words. the examiner is looking for something more sophisticated. Evaluate the ideas used in the passages. Probe, develop. Above all, perhaps make sure that your letter or article is interesting to read and is the linguistic equivalent of a magnificent 170 checkout. Good luck. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring directed writing in the 0627 CIE IGCSE English Language Paper 2. Many thanks for watching.